I've said it before on this channel quite a few times, but when I was a teenager, I spent far too much time playing games where the main objective was to paint the map, and while I've definitely played all the hits, there was one game that caught my attention maybe a little too late to ruin my adolescent social life, and that was Victoria 2. Victoria 2 was, to put it in the nicest terms, a bit of a black box that I didn't understand the internal machinations of, and to be honest, I still don't to this day. I just know what buttons to hit when, which sliders to move, and then hope and pray that an independent Bangladesh doesn't somehow cause the world economy to collapse by hoarding all of the food because of the spearing system. Yes, that could happen in Vicky 2, by the way. While Vicky 2 was this opaque black box, it has what almost every Paradox title has: a group of dedicated weirdos who simply cannot get enough of this particular iteration, the spreadsheet simulator that Paradox has decided to curse us with. But it was by far the least lucrative of the four main spreadsheet simulators they made. Remember, this was long before Imperator Rome was a thing, so hopes of a Vicky 3 were largely a beautiful dream in some isolated corners of the internet. Then, on the 21st of May 2021 at PDXCon, those dreams were made reality, and Victoria 3 was announced. Finally, a game set between 1836 and 1936 I could stream on Twitch without running it in windowed mode. The dream was going to become reality. I tried very hard not to get too excited about this game. After all, it had been nearly a decade since Vicky 2. Who knows if it could really recapture the magic of that game without falling into some of the pitfalls and issues that that game had had before. So that's what this video is going to be. We're going to assess the ultimate review question. Finally, I'm going to do a game review where I actually tell you what reviewers should tell you, which is whether the game is good. But I'm also going to be doing a little bit of a video essay bit where I really try to dig deep into some thoughts on the game and what story it's trying to tell, and whether it's representing that story well in the context of it being a sandbox, as well as see whether they're actually trying to tell a story that's vaguely in line with the actual history it covers. So there are going to be timestamps on this video for those of you who just want the deep thoughts, or those of you who just want the game review part, or ideally you would want both, but I understand, not everything's for everyone. But with that, let's dive straight into it. I'm aware that there have been patches that have caused some issues, like revolutions within revolutions, but I've mostly been playing on the release patch or the early access patch that I got because of Paradox, and I just want to be upfront about that now. I had early access to this game. It's part of the reason why I'm a little ashamed that this video has taken so long to come out, because the content grind has been more grind than content recently. But I managed to get a good deal of time on the game, and I kind of stuck to the release patch because I want my stream playthrough to be fair, but also we have started running into some issues that are fixed by later patches, so next stream I'm gonna have moved off from it. So this is primarily my thoughts on the release version of the game, but I don't believe the core issues identified or points of praise that I have for the game are significantly changed by the new patch. I'm also aware of other critiques, such as there being an ahistoricism in the map, particularly of Africa, and that some people really do not like the new war system. I would argue they don't like it for the wrong reason, but I'm aware that those critiques exist. But those are things that I will address specifically in the second section of the video, because they relate to the idea of this game as a narrative sandbox. Also, I know some people think the game is forcing you to have a command economy, and that command economies are communism, and I might choose to address that later, but for now, just to be absolutely clear, and I want everyone to pay close attention to this point, communism is not when the government does stuff. Now, let's get into some of the things with the game that I don't think worked especially well, and where there's quite significant room for improvement. One of the things that didn't work is that as a market leader, you don't have a particularly fine control over imports and exports to your markets without straight up embargoing or going isolationist. So, to take an example from my stream playthrough, France would constantly import iron from my Ottoman Empire, which kept forcing my market into artificial shortages before I upscaled my arms industry, making my arms industry less viable, which meant I had to embargo France. Another issue is that if we're saying that the market is the primary way through which players are interacting with the game world, which it generally seems to be the case because there is a de-emphasizing of war in particular. A correct decision, by the way, for reasons we'll get into probably in the second part of this video. But if that is the case, then the player needs to have, or certainly if the player's not the market head, then the market head needs to have significantly more options with how to control its market or influence its market. For example, as the Ottoman Empire, I eventually puppeted Egypt. Now, Egypt is brilliant, it's huge, it produces a lot of money for the Padishah's coffers, it's fantastic, it's brilliant, we love that sort of thing. But Egypt has a resource in it, or the potential to develop a resource, opium. Now, I, as the Ottoman Empire, could really use some opium, but Egypt may not develop the opium. So, perhaps the market head should be able to use their construction to build opium plantations in as an example, in countries where they have control, or in countries whose markets they're in control of or in a customs union with. That would probably significantly improve the situation as far as being a market head or at least being a market head with many countries in your customs union would be. That would be a significant improvement in that situation. Another issue is that the amount of civil wars and revolutions needs to be finessed. As the Ottomans in the release patch, it was far, far too easy to suppress separatism, which they famously did not do. They did not suppress separatism. Also, there is the thing about this period of time, which I will mention next in the next section, which is that this particular period of history is a period of history where there was a lot of revolutions. The fact that this game was released with revolutions a bit stunted is not a great sign that they've managed to finesse it. Another thing that doesn't work, and this is really a subset of market-related issues, which is that predictions for profit or productivity could be improved in the release patch. Now, I have played a little bit in the updated version. It does seem to have improved slightly, and I was prepared to accept that these incorrect predictions could be an attempt to reflect uncertainty of market dynamics. I was prepared to accept that. The real main thing that is causing me an issue with this game that really needs to be improved upon is that there needs to be a better explanation of why some things are happening, and it needs to be slightly more accessible. So, to take the example of the market, I understand that if you have more supply than demand of, say, tobacco, then tobacco is going to be very cheap. That stuff is easy to understand, it's relatively easy to access, and to be honest, for a game that is modeling something that is reasonably complex, it actually does quite a good job of displaying some of these things and explaining why some things are happening. Great. But let's take an example from my stream playthrough. In my stream playthrough, I had to go to war with Egypt and Russia. Now, that was a hell of a challenge for the Ottoman military. As you might imagine, historically, that did not go very well. I had an advantage on one of the fronts, which was the Egyptian front, and I had a significant disadvantage on my Russian front. But I was losing on the Egyptian front and winning on the Russian front. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had no clue why that was happening. And I'm reminded of a really, really good piece of design from Crusader Kings 3, which is when you go into battle, you can see the advantage or disadvantage of your forces. Now, in Victoria 3, it might be of use to have some kind of way of displaying that this is the case. That, the Ottoman army has blundered in with a complete dipshit in charge, and he's caused the army to eat shit in its offensive. I'm willing to accept that. You know, the Ottoman army was famously pretty fucking terrible. So I am completely willing to accept that that is the case, and that is completely plausible. It's not that I'm arguing against the result of the game. Like I said, I was winning against the Russians, I was losing against the Egyptians. I eventually won the war anyway. So, you know, just in case anyone thinks this is sour grapes, it's not. So it needs to be made clearer, because then the player can actually fix the things that are happening. For example, if it turns out that your enemy has some military tech above you, it actually might be important for the player to understand that that's why, despite outnumbering the enemy, I don't know, 20-1 or, you know, something like that, that you're losing, because maybe you're running with spears into a machine gun. Historically, that wouldn't end well, but it needs to be reflected and explained a bit more clearly to the player. Also, this is kind of about the war system generally, but there needs to be a way to negotiate separate pieces, because otherwise, the only feasible way to knock an opponent out of the war is to capitulate them, even if they don't have any war goals on you and stuff like that. There needs to be a way for the primary combatant to negotiate on behalf of everyone involved, whether that has to necessarily be the highest prestige party to the conflict or something like that, but there needs to be more flexibility around peace deals, around the way that's going to work. That's probably something that can be developed later. And in that spirit, I want to talk a little bit about things that can be improved quite easily, reasonably easily, right? So the diplomacy system can feel a little shallow, and there should be some more options available to you. For example, as the Ottoman Empire, and I'm going to be using them as my example for a lot of this because they're the country that I've played the most, you have Tripolitania. I'm just going to call it Tripoli because, to be honest, saying Tripolitania several times is going to wear thin on all of us. So you have Tripoli, and Tripoli is your puppet. Now, those of you who are students of history will note that Tripoli was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, like it was a directly governed part of it, so much so that Italy and the Ottoman Empire went to war over it, and in a rare turn of events, Italy displayed relative military competence and managed to win, although they required overwhelming force to do it. Neither here nor there. Now, there should be a way for the Ottoman Empire to peacefully annex its puppets, or indeed for any country to peacefully annex its puppets if it so chooses. That might mean in the case of Britain that they might end up trying to annex the East India Company, which they absolutely should not be allowed to do, but that might mean that we need more resolution in terms of the diplomatic relations available to countries. Hi, Editing SK here. I just wanted to clarify what I meant here because I felt like I was a little tiny bit unclear, because the diplomatic play system does allow for peaceful annexation of puppets because your puppet could just cave. What I meant is that there needs to be a process outside of the diplomatic play system for integration of puppets, or maybe some kind of new relationship to describe what a puppet is meant to be, because Tripoli was like a part of the Ottoman Empire, which is why I was kind of confused by the fact that people could intervene so directly in that process. But, okay, you know, that's me done. I'm going to disappear now. And the other thing that can be improved easily is the war system. Now, a lot of people critique the war system because, just to pick a critique out of thin air, I don't want to be horrible to the people who say this because it's a valid critique if that's what they want from the game. But a lot of the critiques boil down to, I can't see the little army men on the map and can't directly micromanage them. Now, I'm really sympathetic to this because I really, really want to micromanage my army when my Ottoman generals are sending 2 troops against 10,000 Egyptians. Why on earth have they done that, right? It doesn't make any sense. And this is why the main issue with the war system is opacity. It's the fact that we can't see why certain things are happening. Why is the Ottoman Empire sending 2 troops against 14 Egyptians? Why does that happen? How can the player impact that happening, and that can be resolved with relatively simple displays. The game is quite good at displaying information to you if you know where to look. It needs to be made more intuitive. If they manage to make the war system less opaque, a lot of the criticism of it will probably be resolved through that, because the frustration of not being able to micromanage is really because you can't control your troops, and you really want to be able to control your troops. Now, I think that instinct in a game where the market is the primary way in which you act is wrong. I don't think you should want to have such fine control over war. War is a small part of the system, and rightfully so. Now, speaking of making things a bit less opaque, the issue of buy and sell orders and some specific bits of information, it all needs to be made more accessible. Maybe there needs to be some kind of shortcuts, maybe there needs to be some kind of, way of directing people to it. I don't know, but some things need to be made more intuitive to find, and that will come with time. And to be honest, it's not doing that badly at it, but there is one element of it that does need to be urgently addressed, which is applying a filter to the notifications you get in the bottom right. They're mostly covered by my face on the stream, so if you watch my stream at twitch.tv/SKTheCrusader, you do not see the various notifications you get, but you should be able to filter those. In fact, I think there is a mod that lets you filter that out, and that would be a huge quality of life improvement. In fact, CK2 even had a rudimentary filter system, so I don't see why it couldn't be applied as a quick quality of life thing. And with that, I kind of want to get onto what's actually good about the game. Like, what is good about Victoria 3? And one thing is, I think the use of the market system as the primary way in which we engage with the game, interact with the game, is overall a good decision. Now, I think, as I've said, there are improvements to be made to the market system, but I think forcing players to think along the lines of materialism is good, and it's actually a good way to represent the actual interests of imperial powers at play. Think about why you would have an empire. It's not because you want to do it for the fun of it, and it's also not because you believe you have a civilizing mission. It's because there are nice things in a lot of the world, and boy wouldn't they be even nicer if you had them. I'm particularly thinking of my general frustration at the lack of dye in the Ottoman Empire, which is driving me insane. But, that's more an issue for me to fix in the stream playthrough. Another thing that's good about the game is the representation of political interest through interest groups. Now, there is a caveat attached to this, which is that while I think interest groups are good, they do flatten these whole groups of people into holding to one particular political position, partially dependent on who the leader is, partially dependent on whether slavery exists or not, partially dependent on the legal situation in your empire. Now, that is fine as a system as it is, but it does ignore some nuances. And this is where the decision to, represent history versus making a good video game comes into play. I think the decision they've made with a simplified interest group system lends itself to making a good video game rather than representing, the complexities of these groups of people, because there were people in all sorts of different interest groups and all sorts of different classes who did not act perfectly according to their material interest. And while that might be a level of complexity that's simply too much for a game to handle, I think it's worth noting, and I think that a slightly more granular interest group system, maybe even allowing different pops to split a bit more aggressively into new groups, into different groups, and to allow groups to change a bit more obviously or split as interests change, that might be more interesting or something for the future. So for example, not all trade unionists are socialists and communists, and perhaps a representation of that in the system would make a lot of sense. I will just say that I also do like the political party system. Representing political parties as alliances of different interest groups is fantastic. Now, while it's not that simple, and it's never been that simple historically, it is a really, really good approximation for how party formation did happen in this time period. So credit to Paradox on that one. Hi, Editing SK again for a second clarification. So I wanted to explain what I meant by a more granular interest group system. I meant representing complexities like multicultural and multi-religion societies having their own clergy and their own interest. There's definitely scope in the base system as it exists to do that, and I think that adding that into the game would make it a much more interesting and more representative experience of the history it's trying to depict. And with that, I think that's my last interjection from Editing SK. I'm gone. See ya, folks. Get back to the video as it was originally performed, I guess. Another good thing is the system by which you change laws. The way that you change laws is you simply go into your laws system. You need to have an interest group in the governing coalition who wants to change the law. You go and you have a percentage chance every once in a while, depending on your legitimacy, to change the law. And this represents a lot of things really well, and I will talk about it in the second section of this video. Despite the fact that the general direction of travel in this time period was towards liberalization, freedom of conscience, women's suffrage, all of these other things, right? There were groups who were resistant to it and who would put their shoulder to the wheel to try and stop you. Now, this, it turns out, I've played a little bit on the latest patch, does come about through the forms of, movements to restore agrarianism or movements to prevent the abolition of slavery and such. These were real things that happened. Landowners, or in the Ottoman Empire's case, local governors and rural folk, and all sorts of other people would make strange alliances in order to preserve their privilege, because they weren't simply going to give it away. Sometimes they had to have their hand forced. And that is fairly represented. Admittedly, in the release patch, the lack of revolutions meant it wasn't necessarily fairly represented, but as time has gone on, I think that the realization that needed a bit more finessing is a good thing, and I think it will improve as time goes on. The other thing that I think is really good is decentralized nations. Now, I find the line between decentralized and centralized, particularly in Africa, a little arbitrary perhaps, but as we'll come to in the second part, I think it's to represent a perspective and to facilitate certain gameplay. But different modes of colonization and resistance to your attempts to colonize are shown in the game, and I think it leaves a little bit of space for exploration later, and I hope Paradox do explore this, because the question of resistance to colonial powers is one that isn't represented in a video game very much, and I think the game would benefit from, resistance to colonial powers not simply being the fact that they don't have enough tonic water to survive in Central Africa. It should be represented in the form of active armed resistance as it can be from decentralized nations. I think now that they've modified this in the latest patch, that people will intervene on the side of the decentralized power sometimes, that this is going to start representing the real resistance and the real ways in which indigenous peoples resisted colonization much better. And I think that's important. I think that it's a substantial improvement on the empty Africa of old Vicky 2, and I think it will make for a much, much more interesting game in the long run, especially as you would presume from the Paradox dev cycle that we would get DLCs or content packs or whatever that explore these ideas. The other things that are good about the game, to put it in short terms, is that the aesthetic of the game is perfect. It looks great. It really captures the vibe of the time period, at least as I imagine it. And I think it looks good. I think it's a good looking game. I think certainly compared to Victoria 2, it's a good looking game. And a very important thing that I want to note about the game is it is a total time sink. The time does genuinely fly when you're playing it. And as I mentioned earlier, I had early access to it. And before I knew it, I had racked up a lot of hours on that game because of my early access. It really, really was a time sink. To answer the question of whether the game is good, I haven't played it very much on the later patches, which have caused this revolution within revolution problem, but understanding that this is a Paradox game, and as I said earlier, it will have a post-release development cycle and balancing patches. In that context, I'd say it is a good game, because Paradox have had a reputation for releases that have not gone well, to put it in the politest possible way. And I think it certainly lives up to some of the best aspects of Victoria 2. The sense that you are shaping a society does come through, and it's even explicitly shown through the strength of interest groups and, if you're the Ottoman Empire, your industrialization and so on. It does show. And I think it's good if you consider the mark of a good game being that time flies when you're playing it. Improvements should be forthcoming with patches and content packs and DLCs as we would expect from a Paradox game, and I get the argument that upon release that balancing should have been resolved and it shouldn't have been necessary, and that represents an issue with QA and so on. I understand that. I think that we need to remember that Paradox have not managed a lot of releases well in the past, and for it to have come out this good is a surprise. A surprise, but a pleasant one, I would say. So is it worth the money? I would say if you were a fan of Victoria 2, go for it. I'm conscious that we're in November. I don't know if it will be going in the Steam Christmassy sale or whatever. I don't know. It might perhaps be worth waiting to see if that happens. But if you like Victoria 2, go for it. If you like something like Crusader Kings 3, maybe watch other people play it a little bit, get a sense for the system, see if that's a kind of thing that you might enjoy. But overall, it is a recommendation from me, and it was a game that I enjoyed and continue to enjoy. So, yeah, and you can probably tell I enjoyed it because all of the footage in this section was from my Twitch, apart from the stuff that was obviously like trailers or random clips. Anyway, with the review part of it out of the way, let's try and figure out what story this game is trying to tell. Okay, so now I want to think about an interesting question. For me, what story is this game trying to tell? As I was playing the game, I couldn't help but think, whose story is this? Who is it trying to tell us about? And what is it trying to tell us about? And from what perspective is it trying to tell us about it? For example, in Crusader Kings 3, the story of the game is that you are guiding a dynasty through medieval Europe, and all of the characters within the dynasty and their interactions are largely within your control. In Victoria 2, to contrast, and which will be our main comparison point for obvious reasons, you are the disembodied spirit of the nation, guiding various pops and territories through political changes and turmoil. But in Vicky 3, there's something more going on, and something more about who has the agency in the game. So think about the period of time that Victoria 3 is covering, 1836 to 1936. Now, if I asked you to name some interesting events from that period, you will immediately go World War I. Fair enough. But World War I is not the only interesting thing that happened in that time period. The Meiji Restoration, the Oriental Crisis, the Opium Wars. A lot of this stuff is going to have the word crisis in it if you look it up, and a lot of that's going to be in the Ottoman Empire, which, it was a place where a lot of crisis was happening, apparently. But you get the idea. So when you're talking about a time period that is comparatively quite short, but also has a lot going on, you kind of have to make choices as a designer and a developer about what lens you're going to use to represent that, and you have to get it right to make it compelling as a game. And these decisions, as I sort of allude to, are going to impact gameplay and the quality of the game quite significantly. Now, you might say to me about what story this game is trying to tell, or whose story this game is trying to tell. You might look at me like I'm the dumbest person in the world and say, God, it's obviously the story of Europe and its settler colonial outposts in the form of the US and Canada, and the story of how these countries came to dominate the world. I mean, it's called Victoria. How stupid are you, SK? And First of all, you don't need to get that harsh with me, but second of all, yes, it is, but is that all it's able to represent, and all that it's trying to tell us? For example, let's take a look at the map of Victoria 2. And what do you notice first? Probably the fact that Africa is empty. Now, Africa is empty only in the sense that there is no state represented in those areas. There are still people represented mechanically through pops in these areas, so why represent it like this? Well, one reason is because, yes, as you will have said to me in the comments by now, the game is called Victoria, and it's about the period of time where Europeans colonized and imperialized a lot of the world. So Europeans need a continent to brutalize through imperialism, and it needs to work within the mechanisms of the game. Great. Simple. Bit Eurocentric, but actually there's not necessarily anything wrong with a game called Victoria being Eurocentric. Representing it that way is a narrative choice. That means the game is representing the history or the alternative history that unfolds in a particular way. And I would argue that that left something to be desired. Let's take an example of two countries. The Ottoman Empire and Russia. Now, these two countries are not quite what we would consider typical European countries. Yes, they have territory in Europe. Yes, Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. It has that connection to what we understand of Europe. And yes, Russia is heavily involved in European politics, as is the Ottoman Empire. But these countries actually had something different happening to them in this time period to, say, Germany's unification, or Risorgimento in Italy, or France's various periods of revolution, or even Britain's rise to even greater imperial plunder. The Ottoman Empire and Russia were, compared to their contemporaries, quite obsolescent, creaking, slowly decaying empires. Now, Russia turns it around later in the form of the Soviet Union, and the Ottoman Empire is, taken apart, and the former imperial core of it does undergo a sort of nationalist revolution that kind of rapidly modernizes the country, not in a similar way, well, not quite in the same way that the Soviet Union did its rapid industrialization. It was under different pressures and really took quite a bit longer, but nonetheless, these countries do eventually get there. But the point of an alternative history is that you should be able to make a enlightened, modern, powerful Russia or Ottoman Empire. You should be able to make a Russia that's able to beat Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. You should be able to make an Ottoman Empire that is able to reassert its power in the Balkans, or can reassert its power over Egypt and can, compel Algeria to fall in line. I don't know. These are just kind of random thoughts that have come into my head as I was writing this. And the thing about Victoria 2 was, you could create these alternative histories. But what was the process of creating them? In Victoria 2, if you wanted to fix the Ottoman Empire, well, all you needed to do was tax people the correct amount, turn the education slider up and the bureaucracy slider up, and a lot of the problems would slowly begin to go away. It would take a while, certainly, but you could, in theory, create a very powerful modern, well, relatively modern Ottoman Empire. But the thing about the Ottoman Empire is, it wasn't just a matter of turning the funding slider up that was the problem. And in Russia, it's similar issues. It wasn't just a matter of turning the slider up or pressing the abolish serfdom button. It was a series of obstacles that were preventing these countries from doing these things. In fact, many political forces in these countries did think that these were obvious problems that needed to be solved, but they weren't solved largely by them. And Victoria 3 does a better job of representing these nuanced cases. Because yes, the Ottoman Empire and Russia are imperial powers in the time period that we're talking about. But they're not the imperial powers. They are not the imperial powers that are going to be carving up large chunks of Africa. They are imperial powers whose main challenge is internal and about their internal politics. And the game does a better job of explaining and exploring that process than Victoria 2 ever could. Take Japan as an example. Japan's political position in the time period we're talking about was extremely vulnerable and precarious. It was, as the Ottoman Empire was, essentially languishing in obsolescence. Now, it was a high population country with a high literacy rate, with all sorts of other things going on, but it wasn't a modern country in the way that, say, France was at this time. And so that left it vulnerable. And yes, Japan did have to change through the Meiji Restoration and through its rapid period of modernization, and also an awful lot of imperialism in this time period as well. That leads me to the question of whose story is it again? Because these changes and these challenges aren't represented through abstract reactionary revolts. It's not the case that in the Ottoman Empire, if I just give women the vote in Victoria 3, that random red and black flag wielding people will show up and I just have to set my army to automatically go around and squish them. In the game, the armed forces might even be the ones who revolt against me. These interest groups are really the people whose stories are being told in this. And it's the desires of the interest groups that drive gameplay. Think about this. In Britain, we have an awful lot of things, right? Today. Back then, Britain had a higher living standard than pretty much any of its contemporaries or comparable nations. Of course, there were smaller countries who had high living standards. But why then do you go and do imperialism? Like, what compels you, the British, to go to a quarter of the world and say, yes, this is mine now? And I spent a long time kind of thinking about it. Is it pure greed? Maybe a little bit, but that's actually represented through something quite interesting, and it's an interesting little mechanic they have in the game, which is standard of living. Now, standard of living is, in essence, trying to put a number on the quality of life of the people within your empire. Now, in some countries it's low, in some countries it's high, but people do have a minimum expectation of what their standard of living will be. If I said to you, the viewer of this video, hey, you're going to live as a 19th century subsistence farmer, you would probably be quite pissed off at me if I had the political power to force you to do that. And you would be right to be pissed off at me for doing that. It would suck. Being a subsistence farmer is not good. That's why most people, where that's an option, choose not to do it, right? I mean, we could all run away and be subsistence farmers, but let's be real, are we going to do it? Probably not, right? Because it sucks. Now, the fact that standard of living expectations will increase as time goes on. For example, if your society should discover, and I want everyone to brace themselves for this, socialism, well, might the poors expect to have things? And here's the kicker. Britain, the island itself, does not have many things on it, or it doesn't have many of the raw materials that can be processed to make the things that the people want that improve their quality of life. And so what must you do? Well, you go looking around for places that have the things you want. Now, I used the dye example in the first part of the video, and I think that's a handy one to explain, because dye is used, for example, in clothing. And people need clothes. This isn't Ferenginar, where we force half the population to be naked until we make an amendment to the Ferengi Bill of Opportunity allowing females to wear clothes. People need clothes. It is a necessary thing that they want. And if you want to improve the quality of life of people, cheap clothes is a good way to do it. Or grain, or alcohol, or tobacco, or any number of things that people might enjoy. You need to find a way to get those things, bring them to your people, and then they can enjoy it. And this materialist lens of empire, instead of it just being to paint a map, or, you know that rubber is going to exist in a country, so you just go there immediately. Instead of it just being about painting a map, you are responding to material needs and expectations. But most of those material needs and expectations are represented in centralized countries. So you can't play a decentralized country, and that is a choice that does affect narrative. The fact that I can't go and play a Central African decentralized country and try and centralize it in some fashion is a choice that the developers have made that affects the story being told. And that's fine, by the way. They are allowed to make that decision, and before we get any deeper into it, I just want to emphasize a particular point here, which is that depiction is not endorsement, necessarily. So while the developers have chosen to present to us an Africa that's ripe for conquering and colonization, this doesn't mean that the developers at Paradox specifically endorse the horrors of imperialism. And I just kind of want to put that out there. And by playing the game, you're not necessarily endorsing that as well. And there are options to, present a little bit of resistance from the continent of Africa. Sokoto's a pretty good game for that. Morocco, in my stream playthrough, gave Britain a bloody nose and got war reparations from them, which I think was very, very funny of them to do. Now, I do want to talk about the de-emphasizing of war in the game and how that affects whose story we're telling. In the game, I've spent very, very little time at war, or at least very little time actively thinking about war, and I think that's good. Now, the lack of emphasis on war does have a way of rubbing people the wrong way, and I completely understand that people play Paradox games because they are in part war games. Well, if you want to play a war game, might I recommend Hearts of Iron 4 and not Victoria 3, because Victoria 3 is not a war game. It is an economy game with war attached to it. It is a game about materialism and the decisions that empires make in order to improve the material conditions of people in the imperial core, or their imperial core in particular. Because if you do not improve the lives of people to the standard they expect, you might well meet with revolution. I'm not hinting at any particular government of any particular country with this. I just want to say that living standards in some countries have stagnated for a long time, and people notice. Okay? Not to bring the real world into this too much. And this de-emphasizing of war is important because it allows the game space to actually explore more interesting things about this time period. Because the interesting things about this time period are not necessarily the wars themselves. Like, the interesting thing about World War I, yes, there's a lot of fantastic literature, there's a lot of fantastic and interesting stuff written about it, but it's not the actual fighting itself, because the actual fighting itself was mostly sitting in a trench and having dysentery. That's not the interesting part of World War I. The interesting part of World War I is how industrialized societies fed their war machine in such a devastating and brutal way, and effectively fed their people to the slaughter by pointlessly charging into machine gun fire. Or another thing that's interesting, like the Italo-Turkish war over Libya. The interesting thing about it is not that Italy sent 150,000 troops to fight a much smaller Ottoman force. The interesting thing about it is that it was one of the first wars where aircraft were used. That's an interesting thing about it. And it's these developments that are actually much more interesting and much more important to a war system, because your ability to wage war in the game is directly connected to your economy. And that is huge, by the way. An absolutely huge thing to have. Because it means that you have to actually manage your economy as far as you can manage it to actually support war machines if you want to go to war. If you don't want to go to war, then you have to play the diplomacy game and develop yourself in a way that makes you uninvadable. The game offers you much more flexibility in that regard, and that changes who we're thinking about, because we're not thinking about generals leading armies. Generals are characters in the game and they can be very important, but we're not thinking about them. We're thinking about the standard of living, we're thinking about the GDP, we're thinking about making the lines go up, and that's something quite different for this kind of game. I also want to address the idea that this game is making you do communism. Now, communism is a thing you can do in the game, at least aesthetically. I have questions about whether the worker co-op model that the game uses to represent council republics' ways of organizing workplaces is quite the right one, but it is at least an interesting attempt to depict it. And it is not forcing you to do communism. Let me explain what the core of this critique is. A lot of people think that because you have a centralized construction that you are doing communism. I want to kind of bat that away real quick, which is with this point, that it is in the interest of the state to facilitate the exploitation of resources, the exploitation of workers, so that the line goes up, right? Because the state acts in certain interests, and this game forces you as the state, the disembodied spirit of the state, to act in certain interests. But the state is not the main character, not to borrow too heavily from another video I did. The main character is the pops, the interest groups, because the interest groups are how political agency is exercised in the game. And while I think that there's a little bit of room there for the game to improve, I think it's an interesting twist for the game to do this. A lot of games have tried to represent political systems in this way. I don't think any of them have tried to marry it with a spreadsheet simulator quite like Victoria 3. And while I think that the game has its flaws, I do think it's a good game overall, and I do think that there are a lot of interesting things that can be done with it, and can be done with this game as the base of it. I'll also say this about whose story it's trying to tell. Victoria 2 was trying to tell the story of Western Europe first, and America first. I don't like that I said that, but we're gonna have to live with it. This game, through its representation of serfdom, through its representation of various types of slavery that's available to countries, through its calling the landowners in the Ottoman Empire's local governors, through calling the military faction in Japan the samurai, it has tried to tell more stories now. It is enabling you to actually see something quite interesting about a lot of these countries, and I think it is interesting which countries have started out with specific journals, such as the Ottomans' Tanzimat. It's a sign that they're trying to populate the world, not just on the map with Africa, but in general with interesting potential narratives. You don't have to follow Tanzimat as the Ottoman Empire. It's probably recommended that you do, but you can choose to just become this insular, reactionary, obsolescent empire and see what happens. I suspect it wouldn't be very good, and it wouldn't be a very enjoyable game, but you can certainly try and do that. I also want to say, if you're thinking about becoming a Marxist to become good at this game, do it. Just do it. Don't even think about it. Just get on with it. Read the books. Let's go. Let's do it. Let's all become Marxists to be good at this game. Okay everyone, that's more or less the video there. Thank you very much if you watched both sections, or if you just watched one of the sections. I appreciate it either way. Everyone, I do want to shout out my patrons, particularly my top tier patrons. That's Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider. Shout out to them, they are fantastic. If you like this video, if you would like to support me in any way, it is all appreciated. The easiest way to do it is to like and subscribe. We try and do a game review every month. As I said, the content grind was more grind than content recently, but I am feeling much more up to my up to my obligations, if you like. And so I will be trying to get 2 videos out a month. We might have a bit of a bumper month this month because I am feeling particularly energetic for some reason. So we'll see how that all plays out. But everyone, thank you so much. Remember to like and subscribe. I know I already said it, but you gotta say it as a YouTuber. And I will catch you all in the next one. Goodbye.